Greetings, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, Rhetoric, Responses, Challenges. My name is Rafal Stepien, and I'm Assistant Professor in Comparative Religion here in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, which is hosting this event. I will introduce our speakers in just a moment, but allow me firstly to just outline the structure of today's webinar. We have two speakers, each of whom will be initially presenting their talk for up to 30 minutes or so, and that will leave us approximately half an hour for open discussion. I would ask that you please leave your camera off throughout the presentation so as not to overload the system, and microphones, of course, should be muted throughout. Thank you. This webinar is being recorded and it will become available on our school website shortly within the coming days or weeks. Now, naturally, we welcome you to the event. We're very glad to see quite a large turnout with participants coming from not just the local and the regional sphere, but from all over the world. Everybody is very welcome to contribute to the discussion. As the convener, I am happy to pose your questions to the speakers, and so you are requested to kindly place your questions into the chat feature in the Zoom room. Of course, the topic under discussion today is a sensitive one, and I know that it is one that is a topic amenable to strong and differing views, let's put it that way. So I would request that audience members posing questions and comments simply remain respectful and open-minded throughout. After all, we have two truly distinguished experts on Buddhism in Myanmar and Sri Lanka with us, and I will now introduce them with great pleasure. Speaking first will be Matthew Walton. Matthew Walton is Assistant Professor in Comparative Political Theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Professor Walton's research focuses on religion and politics in Southeast Asia, and his first book, Buddhism, Politics and Political Thought in Myanmar, was published in 2016 with Cambridge University Press. After Professor Walton, we will have Elizabeth Harris. Professor Harris is an honorary senior research fellow within the Edward Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Professor Harris is a former president of the European Network of Buddhist Christian Studies, and she is the current president of the UK Association for Buddhist Studies. Among her many publications as author and editor, I'll just mention Religion, Space and Conflict in Sri Lanka and Buddhist Responses to Religious Diversity, Theravada and Tibetan Perspectives. And so, without further ado, that's enough from me for the moment. It is my great pleasure to invite Professor Walton to present your talk. Matthew Walton, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Rafal, and for the invitation, and to RSIS for hosting the event today. Can I just confirm that everybody can see the PowerPoint there?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So to begin, I'd just like to indicate that parts of my talk today rely on work that's done not just by me, but by a research team that I had convened at Oxford in previous years when I was there, made up of colleagues Makin Mamaji, A. Thane, and the late So'an Thamwe, one of the colleagues on our research team who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. So I want to try to cover quite a lot of ground today. It's going to be an ambitious amount of ground. So I'm going to do that by being a little bit thin on detail in some sections of the talk, but I really welcome questions that let us dig down into some of that detail, especially in comparison and in conversation with Professor Harris's talk. And so, I'll talk about, and actually I'll kind of question and challenge some of the dynamics of what we've tended to call Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar over the last decade, with a little bit of reference to how certain dynamics were established before then. So I want to start out with a little bit of a cast of characters here. So some of the key actors that I'll sort of talk about, that you should know about in this space. were first the 969 movement. You see its logo up at the top. This was a reference. 9, 6, and 9 were the key qualities of the Buddha, the Sangha, or the Dhamma and the Sangha, the community of monks. This was, a kind of never really an established organization. Emerged in the sort of early, 2010s and kind of before that. But really nothing more than a kind of loose network that had a shared symbolism. Groups would kind of take up that symbolism to anchor movements and activities and things like that. But this was always a really kind of like loose network. And then you had Mabatha, Amyo Bada Thadana Samsham Ye Poi in Burmese, that we often translated it as the Organization for the Protection of Race and Religion, formed in 2013. And this one quickly became significantly more prominent and significantly more influential. It was notable because it was a lay monastic association, right? So it wasn't just monks, it wasn't just lay people, and it was, in comparison to 969, significantly more centralized, led by a few prominent monks. But I think it's really important that we understand that Mabatha also functioned. I mean, it was an organization, but it also functioned primarily as an umbrella group. And often, even to its some of its victims and people who worked against it, as a kind of catchphrase for a whole lot of different activities. There was pretty limited direct control that the kind of top monks and the sort of central authorities within Mabatha had over the activities of monks and lay people around the country. And I say that not to absolve some of those more senior monks from responsibility of the kinds of things that was done under Mabatha's name, or in subsequent years, but just to give a good sense of actually how sort of how fractious and uncontrolled a lot of these activities were. And it's important that we also understand that part of the way that happened was that there were a lot of groups that were either loosely affiliated with Mabatha, informally affiliated. There was never a kind of card-carrying membership for individuals or for groups. Sometimes that affiliation happened even through a single individual. So somebody who for a long time was running a donation group or running a Buddhist Sunday school or something like that would kind of also engage with Mabatha, and then a lot of their activities would sort of look like they were happening under the guise of and the aegis of Mabatha. And so, the way that I often describe this is that Mabatha sort of stepped into a kind of vacuum of a religio-political vacuum, right, in that moment. And because of its branding that we're going to unpack here in a moment, was able to kind of take up all this space and become the sort of group that everybody like looked to, but it didn't actually exert sort of direct control over a lot of the activities that Buddhists were doing that had preceded it, that it kept on going during its time, and that kept going afterwards as well. So the other group here that's kind of important, and it's where the Burmese acronyms can get a little bit confusing, is a group that in Burmese we shorten to Mahana, but known kind of formally as the State Sangha Mahanayaka Committee. This was the official national monastic hierarchy established in Myanmar only in the 1980s, with a little bit of resistance from monks, but also some support from monks who really wanted a kind of centralized, recognized body as well, for prestige purposes, for disciplinary purposes, a wide variety of reasons. But the tradition up until that point had been a rather decentralized Sangha community of monks. And so it's really important for us to understand Mahana is this official body under government control, nominally under the authority of the Ministry of Religious and Cultural Affairs in Myanmar, earlier versions of that as well. But then, an organization that kind of has this really uncertain relationship, both with government authorities and then because of that, with various monastic critics as well. So, as is absolutely the truth, the roots of some of these dynamics lie much further back in history. Again, we can get into some of that in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'm really going to look at this more contemporary scope here. So we'll talk a little bit about the period where 969 and Mabata really came into being, when the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the USD, the military aligned party, was in control of the government. This was from 2011 to 2016. This was a period where government leaders were very supportive of, even praised Mabata leaders. They supported legislation that they put forward, generally declined to strongly prosecute anti-Muslim violence during this period. Then you had the period where the National League for Democracy, the kind of democratic opposition party, the NLD, co-founded by Aung San Suu Kyi, the period where they were nominally in control of the government from 2016 to 2021. So I say nominally because this was a period where the military still formally controlled some key ministries. And this was a period where Mabata began to receive more public criticism from members of the government. It even faced censure from Mahana, the formal monastic authorities, which was kind of unthinkable in the previous period. It's important that we clarify exactly what that was. That was a series of orders from Mahana that essentially disavowed Mabata as an official Sangha group, and eventually, after several iterations, kind of functionally outlawed the group from operating under its existing name. Now, the effect of those orders was pretty varied. In some areas, it seemed to work as a kind of suppression tool. So Mabata's influence dropped pretty sharply. In others, it merely kind of pushed Mabata into morphing into other groups. So some just kind of reverted back to their previous public donation group status. Others started to turn into more politicized groups, even political parties. And in some of those activities went more underground into kind of more vigilante groups. And we can track something of a through line from some of those groups through to some of the vigilante groups, pro-regime vigilante groups today. In some parts of the country, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, there was stronger resistance to Mahana's orders, where groups refused to give up the Mabata name. But so all in all, while the National League for Democracy government made some efforts to suppress Mabata and more generally to suppress anti-Muslim violence and sentiment outside of Rakhine State, this was the period that also coincided with some of the worst years of genocidal violence against the Rohingya Muslim community, primarily living in Rakhine State. And that was led by military, security, and paramilitary forces, particularly in 2016, 2017. Now, the NLD government didn't participate sort of actively in that violence initially, but did defend the military afterwards and both minimize and vilify Rohingya victims. Finally, the last part that I'll talk about over the course today is the 2 years since the military coup of February 2021. And it, and we can look at this roughly this kind of decade here. And even though it's just a relatively short period, there are stark shifts in the kind of prominence and fortunes of these Buddhist activist groups like Mabata over this time. A few important through lines that we'll try to identify. And I will say, the outcome of the coup, the brave and principled resistance to it by so many corners of Myanmar society is really uncertain. And so, I'm going to do limited prognostication here, but I'll talk to some of the dynamics that might persist no matter what the outcome of that struggle is. So I'm going to make the somewhat provocative claim here that when we talk about Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar, we're talking about kind of the wrong phenomenon, or maybe more precisely, we're talking about something that doesn't accurately or adequately describe what was happening there, especially over the last decade, in relation to both Buddhist and national identities and sentiments. I'm not going to get into this theory too much, but I think the concept of assemblage can help us make sense of both the kind of contingency and the fractiousness of what at times seemed like a really coherent, influential, centralized movement, but upon closer examination consists of distinct actors and groups with complex, changing, sometimes overlapping or resonant interests, sometimes contradictory and opposed interests. And it helps us understand how this movement could at times look really dominant nationwide, like a real threat and persistent threat to interreligious understanding and life, but at the same time contain multiple fracture points. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. Seeing this movement through an analytical lens of assemblage also gives us the tools to not just tease apart its material components, but also its varied points of reference and the ideas that brought it together. That is, so, each of its components, Buddhism and Buddhisms, nationalism and nationalisms, anti-Muslim sentiment. That's just a few of them here. All those are themselves made up of multiple inputs, but taken together, they kind of contribute to us seeing each component as a distinct and persistent category. The anti-Muslim aspect of this movement, probably the thing that brought the most people together, alongside concerns about the position of Buddhism in society, that drew on recent globalized narratives that had roots in longer trajectories of colonialism, Orientalism, as well as kind of hyper-local articulations, right, that were articulated in certain parts of Myanmar with reference to certain local dynamics, and then kind of effectively generalized by certain monastic and lay actors across Myanmar as a whole to try to kind of to augment their validity. And so what I'm going to do here today is try to break this down into three axes of disaggregation. First is the contestations of Buddhism, Buddhist subjectivities, Buddhist practice. Next is the contestation over nationalism and the various nationalisms that were at play here in Myanmar. And then I'll kind of ask if, Buddhist nationalism is the appropriate, or is it kind of coherent or linked? It's coherent as a linked term to describe most of what was happening here. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the post-coup dynamics. So looking at this movement, we can see that there's quite a lot of contestation over what Buddhism is, what is appropriate Buddhist practice. We saw in Myanmar one strain of this that went into arguments over Dhamma, which is the Pali word for the teachings of the Buddha, versus Adhamma, or things that are against the Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha. There was actually at one point a lay-led group called the Anti-Adhamma organization that was trying to anti-Adhamma, so against the things that are against the Buddha's teachings. They were labeling monks like Uwirathu and more generally anti-Muslim activities as Adhamma, as against the Buddha's teachings. And so, really what we're kind of asking here, and what different movement actors were asking, is what are the appropriate actions for Buddhists, and then particularly for monks as well. And that's been a key question through the 20th and 21st centuries. There's a long history of monks being involved in political demonstrations, campaigning. Obviously, we have a different political landscape in Sri Lanka that we'll hear about. But monks have also always been socially involved in some ways in the Theravada world. But more recently, we've seen in the last 2 decades or so in Myanmar, we've seen monks leading these larger social welfare projects, often called Parahita projects in Burmese, collecting donations, not just for monks, which would have been the normal practice, but for the poor, for disabled people, for orphans, and for other groups. And so there's a kind of significant intervention in what had always been the dynamics of Theravada donation practice here, where you would always donate to a monk because they had the higher degree of merit, and that would, the higher standing, that would give you more merit. Here we've seen interventions into that. And this is, even though we kind of often frame that as a sort of like progressive challenge or progressive innovation, the image on the top here is from Taki Thue, one of the Mabata journals, and it shows monks in the movement intentionally donating to lay people and to children, right, to kind of show that they're really wrapped up in some of those same changes there. And the thing that I want to point out really is that this is a political question, right? What is appropriate action for a monk? It's always been a political question, and it is used as such in moments like this. Monks use the justification that whatever they're doing work that's promoting and protecting Buddhism, because that's within their vocational purview. People, monks and lay people, also use this as a way of criticizing or delegitimizing monks or actions of monks that they disagree with, right? And so that's kind of unresolved in a sense, but that's available terms for arguing. And I'll also say that this kind of Dhamma Adhamma argument was circulating rhetorically, but never really seemed to be a very effective critique, partly because it was still hard for people to speak out publicly against monks at this time. So you see that written here, Mabatha versus Mabatha. And this is some shorthand that our research team developed to kind of understand some of the dynamics that were happening here. So let me explain Mabatha first. So the Burmese name of this organization, Amyo Bada Thathana Samshao Ye Apwe. Amyo Bada Thathana are the kind of like the three things that Mabatha was established to protect. Samshao Ye's protection organization. And what's really key for us to understand here is that this is, as my colleague Benedict Brakte-Perrier has articulated, this is a kind of relatively recent and distinctive articulation of these three identities together. But they've also been kind of shifting, and they make reference to kind of shifting communities. So Amyo, the first one, literally translates as kind of type of person. Linguistically, it has something to do with kind of kinship and relationality, but it's also aligned more in some ways with a kind of racialized understanding of identity. The related word lumio is the common translation for ethnicity, but also race, and sometimes can also refer to a kind of national identity as well. Now, Mabatha in its published writings considered Myo here to align with another identity category, Dayentha, which is the list of officially recognized groups that comes from the government, this mythical 135 list. Bada is the word in this case, Badaye, for religion more generally. So this was a way for Mabatha to talk about how it was supporting the recognized religions in Myanmar, which explicitly at times included Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and others. And then Thathana is the word for the Buddha's dispensation, right? All the teachings of the Buddha, all the material culture, the lived experience of the practice among people. And so Thathana is much more specifically referring to Buddhism. So when we capitalize Mabatha, that refers to the organization that we understand had a particular conception of Amyo Bada Thathana, right? And tried to kind of corner the market on their particular conception. But what we found is that a kind of sentiment that said, yes, we should promote and protect Amyo Bada Thathana, differently understood, right, was actually really widespread among Buddhists, even many people who didn't necessarily support Mabatha. And so the photo down at the bottom is from the Dhamma School Foundation that ran these sort of like Buddhist Sunday school classes. And their second term of this sort of like pledge, it says, Ngaro the Amyo Bada Thathana o Taintain Abame. So that is a pledge that little kids would take to say, I pledge to, kind of keep and protect Amyo Bada Thathana, right? So we have a kind of contestation of terms here as well. So there are these questions about how to protect it, right? Partly this is a kind of ends means question. What kind of work is necessary at times? What kind of work is appropriate at times for monks and for lay people? But it's also a question about the right kind of action here, right? So protection is built into Mabatha's name as a group. But for many, it's always been about the promotion of Buddhism, about teaching kids, about encouraging good practice, and some of those same activities in the context of, political change and uncertainty, widespread narratives of threat, they overlap with kind of protection of Buddhism as well. Also, these questions about who should protect, monks or laity. So Mabatha was pretty distinctive as this lay monastic association. But there were these questions about, kind of like who should protect and who should define it. And I already mentioned that the differences between Mabatha's narrative and the kind of lowercase Mabatha, the sort of generalized sentiment of these things. And it's worth noting that the Dhamma School Foundation often went out of its way to separate itself from Mabatha over this period. Then we've got these challenges of like who should protect it. This is a Mabatha versus Mahana challenge or opposition, Mahana being the state sanctioned body. There have been longstanding criticisms of Mahana. People say they're too controlled by the government. So monks complain that they don't do their job sticking up for Buddhism, sticking up for monks. At the same time, monks also complain that they don't do their job in disciplining and controlling recalcitrant monks, right? And so Mahana is really in a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. In the 2007 protests, monks were critical of Mahana for taking a government line kind of against the protest and not really speaking out and joining the monks. Under the NLD, Mabatha monks were critical of Mahana for allegedly being too close to the government, for being politicized, for cracking down on Mahana. So again, this is a sort of unresolvable tension. Mahana as the kind of central organization needs legitimacy, it needs an enforcement mechanisms, but it also doesn't have a way of influencing public opinion. And actually, one of the reasons why initially some Mahana monks were supportive of Mabatha was that they saw it as a way that some people could act outside the formal system to influence politics. So there was a kind of convergence at the moment. And then when Mabatha got a little less controlled and was threatening the prestige, then that became a marriage of convenience that was no longer useful there. So contested nationalisms. Anybody who's familiar with Myanmar's politics is probably familiar with the ethnic identity and divides here. The civil conflict has been largely based on ethnic identity. But we've got differing effects here, right? So they're largely within Mabatha, the organization, at its central and highest levels, there was ethnic Burman dominance. The Burmans are the majority group there. And there was a presumption that when people say a Myo Badathatana, that it was a kind of Myanmar nationalism and a shared Myanmar nationalism there. But once we dig down deeper into some of these groups, it's very clear that that's not the Myo that other groups are talking about. So just to take two examples, in Rakhine State, among Rakhine Buddhists, ethnic Rakhine Buddhists, there was always really weak support for Mabatha as an organization. And in part, that's because there was strongly established kind of existing Rakhine cultural groups that very effectively for decades had molded together a kind of ethno-religious identity, and they were already robustly supporting those things. So monks like Uwirthu spoke there, but in our interviews, people didn't really particularly respect him or identify the struggle that he saw with the struggle that they saw themselves, kind of engaged in. In Karen State, again, Karen, probably the majority of Karens are Buddhist, although the Karen ethnic resistance has identified more closely with Christianity. You saw aggressively strong support for Mabatha in Karen State. They were one of the chapters that, after being disciplined by Mahana, refused to drop the name or take down their signboards and things like that. And in part, there was some remarkable overlap in the top membership of Mabatha and of the state level Mahana committee there. There were also strong links to Buddhist Karen armed groups. So there was a real way of associating support for Mabatha as an organization there with distinct support for Karen Buddhism and a kind of besieged Karen Buddhist identity in the context of not only national politics, but Karen politics as well. And so this leads us to, I think, question kind of, Buddhist nationalism as a category. Certainly there were avowed sort of Buddhist nationalists, individuals who linked these two together explicitly, but that wasn't really a lot of what we saw happening there. So my colleague Iselin Friedenlund has suggested the term Buddhist protectionism is more appropriate. I think that's definitely better than Buddhist nationalism, because these activities were often not directed towards nationalism, but consistently toward the promotion and protection of Buddhism. And I think, when we foreground protectionism, it still doesn't capture that kind of promotion there, right? If you take away the anti-Muslim orientation, just many of the activities that Mabatha engaged with looked like promotion of Buddhism. That's what we often translate in English as like sasana, thathana, propagation, right? This has always been some work of monks here, but this has been more political and politicized at a time of transition and uncertainty. I also mentioned that these views on the state-Buddhism relationship, right? So we see strong efforts for a strong state support of Buddhism, right? Which would seek to kind of bring the Buddhism and the nationalism together. That's consistent with some longstanding political narratives in Theravada countries, but then also deep criticism of state control over Buddhism, for the state to kind of get its fingers out of there and hands out of there. So a real uncertain orientation towards a key national institution, obviously the state. Teaching Buddhism really became, you know, a kind of focus here and an area of contestation. Like, where should we be teaching it? Should this be in part of the national curriculum? Should it be, you know, the purview of family and other groups? But what did overlap was this broad sense of anxiety about children learning Buddhism, about kids growing up learning how to be good Buddhists, right? And this overlapped groups like Mabata and groups like the Dhamma School Foundation, which sought to you know, differentiate itself from Mabata. This is the cover of one of the curriculum books from Dhamma School Foundation here. And they went out of their way to kind of focus on pedagogy as well, kind of critical thinking skills, and really align themselves with a lot of the other movements happening during the transition there. So teaching Buddhism became this moment of arguing and divergence, but you did have a significant convergence on the exclusion, demonization of Muslims more broadly, and then at some point Rohingya in particular. And that was enabled by these sort of 9/11 post-global war on terror narratives, also by particular domestic dynamics. And so partly this was constitutional provisions specific to Myanmar, but also by things like Rakhine narratives of this longstanding threat from Islam coming from the West. Those had predated Mabata. Those were often articulated primarily as Rakhine things, but then they got effectively nationalized again by a few key actors. So briefly, in our kind of post-coup considerations, we have seen sort of reciprocal support between the military coup government and what I call post-Mabata groups, right? The groups that kind of either went underground and conducted vigilante activities, or you know, or maintain their kind of charitable work as well. We see evidence of incorporating these groups into counter-revolutionary activities, including monks organizing paramilitary groups. I think the photo from above is at the top is from one of these groups in Sagaing. The middle photo is in the middle, in the white shirt, Senior General Manan Thein, and then also on the far right, Sidigu Sayadaw, who was formerly the most popular and influential monk in the country, who's now been widely condemned for his support of the junta. He had pretty effectively played both sides for about a decade and a half, and then made his choice eventually and was condemned for it. So that's on the one side. And so we see the persistence of kind of some of these groups and the individuals and the sentiments. We see the regime really doubling down on a lot of its kind of anti-Muslim, but also kind of anti-liberal, you know, trying to kind of link revolutionary groups in with this terrorism narrative, destroying Buddhism, destroying the country. On the other side, we see a strong revolutionary push for broader inclusion, contesting these existing nationalist narratives, explicit calls by a number of especially younger revolutionaries for apologies to the Rohingya, re-examining the dynamics in the country here with other groups. Now that sets up a future possible confrontation with anti-Muslim groups, certainly, but it also lays out a kind of different baseline for political rhetoric and the kind of expectations from, you know, civil society and from the broader citizenship. And then finally, this notion of public criticism of pro-regime monks. And, you know, before the coup, I would have felt really comfortable saying some variant of like, you know, it's really hard for people to kind of speak out publicly against monks. There's a widespread, you know, respect for the institution and deep respect for certain monks, if not, you know, in every case. And it would have been unthinkable to do a lot of that. And yet, you know, we've seen vitriolic language towards Sidigu Sayadaw and others, you know, for their support of the regime. We don't know what long-term this effect will have on the prestige of the Sangha, on the Sangha as an institution, but it's certainly worth mapping and tracking to recognize the ways in which this revolutionary sentiment, nominally against the kind of military coup, has also been a wider revolution against, you know, a number of different you know, persistent social dynamics. So I will leave it there, and I'll look forward to, you know, questions and discussion with Professor Harrison with you at the end. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Matthew. In that case, I will ask Elizabeth Harris to join us and to present us your paper. We can see you, and I believe you're just
about to
sharing the slides. There we are.
not there yet. I hope they will be soon. Yeah. There's a lot of happening. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, got that. Yes, well, it's very good to be here, and I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on nationalisms in Sri Lanka. I'm going to be looking at roots and expressions, and spending quite a lot of time on, well, how did Sinhala Buddhist identity develop in Sri Lanka, and how has it expressed itself? And this is the plan of my presentation. Start with some of the narrative and performative roots of Sinhala Buddhist identity, and then touch on the impact of European colonialism and Orientalism on the growth of Sinhala Buddhist identity in Sri Lanka, then moving to the post-colonial Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, and I'll call it nationalism after 1948, and then the contribution of this to ethnic war, and then touch on the contemporary challenges that kind of face Sri Lanka now, and the multiplicity of challenges, basically. And so my argument is that Buddhist nationalisms, and I will not use the singular there, Buddhist nationalisms in Sri Lanka don't open to one key, and that secondly, there's a sense of Singhalaness, a Buddhist Singhalaness that was linked to religion, existed before European colonialism, but of course at that time it can't be seen as full-blown nationalism. And I will argue that colonialism and Western Orientalism added new dimensions, and I'll touch on two of these. A sense of victimhood because of Christian missionary activity, and the othering of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka because of the Aryan theory or myth that was developed in the West. And I'll also argue that in the post-independence period, the majoritarian parliamentary structure that was bequeathed to Sri Lanka by the British kind of fed in to the growth of Buddhist nationalisms, but didn't create them. And I'll be drawing quite a lot on my 2018 monograph, Religion, Space and Conflict in Sri Lanka. For those of you who are not familiar with the country, just a few facts to orientate you. In Sri Lanka, there are three kind of main groups, ethnic groups you could call them. Sinhalese are about 75% of the population. Tamils 15 to 16%, and these include the Tamils of the north and east who have been in Sri Lanka for a couple of thousand years probably, and also the Indian Tamils who came during the colonial period to work in the Central Hill country on the plantations, the coffee and then tea plantations. And then you have a sizable Muslim population of about 9% according to the last census. Now the north and east of the country, some parts of these are majority Tamil. So there are parts of Sri Lanka where the Tamil minority is in the majority. 4 religions in Sri Lanka, most of the Sinhalese are Buddhist, most of the Tamils are Hindu, mainly Shaivite, of course the Muslims and Islam, and Christianity. About 7.5% of Sri Lankans are Christian, and that stretches across the Tamil and Sinhala populations. So narrative and performative roots of Sinhala Buddhist identity in Sri Lanka, and I'm going to just use the lens of the independent Kandyan kingdom in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now in that kingdom, according to research that has been done, yes, porous boundaries existed between religions. The kingdom was multi-ethnic and multi-religious with a singular Buddhist majority. And there were some porous boundaries between religions, but within a strict hierarchy. And I think this is very important. The Buddha and Buddhism were placed at the top. Other religious communities were embraced and accepted if they recognized the predominance of Buddhism. And James Duncan has done a wonderful kind of human geography study of how this kind of expressed itself in the landscaping of the kingdom, the Kandyan kingdom. Tambaya, S.J. Tambaya has also studied this. So a kind of hierarchy of importance, really, and rooted in a fear of fragmentation. Hierarchy was a bastion against chaos. And particularly Michael Roberts, in his study of singular consciousness in the Kandyan kingdom, stresses, yes, a sense of singularness was there and boundaries between the singular Buddhists and others. And I've called this in some of my own research a kind of inclusive subordination, a kind of subordination of the other who was not Buddhist, but yet including them within the polity, if they accepted the hegemony of Buddhism. And this was supported by narrative, performance, by ritual. And according to Roberts, the imaginaire included the view that really the whole island was Sinhala. It belonged to the singular people. And this is reinforced by historical chronicles such as the Mahavamsa and the Rajavali. In the Mahavamsa, the Buddha is seen as visiting the island 3 times during his lifetime. And those visits embrace the north of the country, the south and the center. And also within the Mahavamsa, as many of you will know, the Buddha on his deathbed is recorded as giving into the protection of the god Sakha, the island of Sri Lanka, so that his teaching, the Dharma, could be practiced in purity. Later narratives in Sri Lanka add other points around the country, the coming of a sapling from the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha gained enlightenment from India. And the belief is that that came into the north of Sri Lanka. The coming of a tooth relic, which is now enshrined in the Dalida Maligawa in Kandy, coming in the east of the country. So the coast of Sri Lanka is surrounded by Buddhist narrative. And this is reinforced by the performative rituals in the Kandyan kingdom, which I don't have time to go into. So really, Sri Lanka, the coastline is surrounded by narrative. The center of Sri Lanka is also surrounded by Buddhist narrative. So you have Buddhist narratives surrounding the majority Tamil areas in the north and the east. And I've been impressed by research by Stephen Berkowitz and Christian Schiebel into the Mahavamsa and into other texts, stressing that it's not what the past is, but what it does in terms of the singular Buddhist imaginaire, inspiring and affirming religious identity rather than just being a record of the past, uniting Buddhists through the moral task of protecting Sinhala, protecting the integrity of the island for Buddhism and for the Sinhala people. And as researchers such as Michael Roberts and Roshan de Silva Wijeratna have stressed, in this kind of imaginaire, Tamils, the minority, the substantial minority, could be placed in the category of the demonic if they threatened the unity of the island and threatened fragmentation. So the imaginaire of singular Buddhist identity, and here of course I'm generalizing tremendously, is that yes, this integrity of the island must be kind of protected almost as the body of the Buddha, and that any threat to that can be seen as demonic, any threat to fragmentation. So what about European colonialism and Orientalism? Well, just 2 aspects I have time to touch on. Christian missionary activity, I've done a lot of work on this. Buddhists, according to archival evidence, at first sought a kind of pragmatic coexistence with the independent Christian missionaries that arrived in the first and second decades of the 19th century in then colonial Ceylon. They were products of independent missionary societies who could not be controlled by the state, although the state sometimes tried to control them. And they came with a kind of exclusivist theology through which they could present their wish to convert Buddhists and Hindus as an act of compassion, in other words, to save Hindus and Buddhists from eternal damnation. And if you have a cosmology such as this, then in a sense, Buddhism has to be undermined, has to be presented as completely inefficacious. So in this context, Buddhists at first sought coexistence, but this wish was completely betrayed. And so eventually it led to a polemical mutual demonization of Buddhists and Christians, one for the other. And this was defensive action on behalf of the Buddhists. It can be seen in the Panadura debate and in many other instances that I researched. So yes, coexistence betrayed, mutual interreligious demonization resulting. Also, I believe Buddhists in Sri Lanka learnt exclusivism from the British, how to exclude the other from religious space. The missionaries tried to do this and certainly drew a boundary between Christianized space and Buddhist space, Hindu space in the north of the country. And a similar kind of ethos can be seen in some of the Buddhist revivalists working in Anuradhapura at the end of the 19th century and insisting that Christian institutions, Hindu institutions must be pushed out of the holy area. So the missionary effect. Now the Aryan theory. Of course, the Aryanism began as a theory of language, and the Sinhala language, because it was linguistically a descendant of Sanskrit, was seen as an Indian Aryan language in Western Orientalist discourse. Then, as many of you will know, it became a racial theory. So the Sinhala race, according to the British, became an Aryan race, a cousin of the Europeans. And the British people who held this view kind of thought of themselves as progressive because they were actually affirming the Sinhala people as their cousins racially. And the Sinhala people, of course, were well acquainted with the term Aryan from their own Pali texts, Aryan meaning noble, but referring not to kind of racial identity or community identity, but to a moral nobility. But eventually, Sinhala Buddhists internalized the racial distinction made by the British. The Sinhala as pure, as Aryan, Tamils as invaders, as Dravidians. There's no time to go into eugenics, but of course the British used this for racial profiling, and again, was internalization of this. Linked to the kind of the British and the Western appropriation of the Mahavamsa and other historical chronicles, the Sinhala people internalized that Sinhala history was one of decline in face of external threats. There were some voices that contested this. One civil servant who was British, Burroughs, and his archaeological work in places such as Anuradhapura, he argued that Tamils were co-creators of the ancient Buddhist capitals, that the archaeology there shows that South Indians were involved. And he got a lot of stick for this from others within the civil service, saying, well, this kind of blasts the view that the Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa were products of the Aryan imagination and inspiration. But there were voices contesting that. And then there was Christopher Brito. He was Tamil, Roman Catholic. He published in 1879 a Tamil history of Jaffna, in which he argued that Sinhalese originally had meant all the inhabitants of Ceylon, irrespective of race, and that even according to the Mahavamsa, the early Sinhalese were intermarried and really were very much Tamil. So But it was not that narrative that fed ongoing Sinhala Buddhist identity. It was the Tamil as invader paradigm that fed that. So 1948 was when Sri Lanka became a dominion and in effect independent. And so post-colonial Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, I like Isoline's word protectionism, because nationalism was a form of protectionism, of protecting of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And it was driven, I think, by a sense of victimhood. And this victimhood was driven by the points I placed on this screen. Christianity that dominated education. There were Buddhist schools, but majority of top schools were run by Christian missionaries and convert Christians. Buddhists saw Tamils as disproportionately represented in the civil service. They saw their language, the Sinhala language, as subordinated. They looked back to the British attitude to land and the wasteland ordinances and almost the theft of the plantation areas in the Central Hill Country away from Sinhala Buddhist villages. So a kind of sense of victimhood concerning the land of Sri Lanka. And this sense of victimhood was expressed in a study that was commissioned in 1953 and which resulted in a publication called The Revolt in the Temple. And this looked at the state of Buddhism in the post-independence period and the effect of colonialism on Buddhism. And key to the report was that the Sinhalas and the whole island were, as it were, one. And yes, in this report, there were minority voices included, but they voiced what I called a subordinating inclusivism. Yes, you know, we're here, we're accepted, but the Buddhist community are the dominant one and must be seen as dominant. And yes, and this report kind of fed into the growth of popular Sinhala nationalism in the 1950s that was based on really land, Sri Lanka, nation, the Sinhala Buddhist nation, religion, Buddhism, language, the Sinhala language. And this came to a head in 1956 when there was what was called the Buddha Jayanti, which is a celebration of 2,500 years since the Buddha's death. And really, mythologically, 2,500 years since the formation of the Sinhala race, when Vijaya is supposed, according to the Mahavamsa, is supposed to have arrived in Sri Lanka in the same year. And this nationalism that arose in the 1950s was exploited by politicians such as Bandaranaike, who won a resounding political victory in 1956. And connected with it was a yearning among Sinhalas for an idealized past, when Buddhism was recognized as the foremost religion in Sri Lanka, recognized as having power, and that everyone in Sri Lanka almost recognized that Sinhalas have only one country. Tamils have, Tamil Nadu, and so on. And the ascendancy of Bandaranaike and his party led to legislation which was considered detrimental by the minority communities. And this legislation could be passed because of the centralized majoritarian parliamentary structure bequeathed by the British. And I think this is quite important because it's key to the growth of the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. Because in a sense, the Tamil parliamentarians could only push through parliament legislation that they were concerned about if they got Sinhala acceptance. They could not push it through on their own within this kind of centralized majoritarian parliamentary structure. And so there was a press from the Tamil parliamentarians for some kind of devolution of power. So now going to, there's no time for me to go into a whole genesis and key periods of the ethnic war, but eventually it kind of centered on the demand of militant Tamil youth groups for a separate state. But there was a long progression of events to get to the point of the arising of the youth, of these youth groups. And I think Sinhala Buddhist nationalisms or Sinhala Buddhist protectionism influenced the growth of these militant Tamil groups in the following ways. One, Buddhist voices, Buddhist concerns opposed two pacts that were actually signed in 1956 and 1965 that would have given some form of devolution to the north and east, but they were abrogated. And Buddhist monks were involved in this, some Buddhist monks. I will never generalize for the monastic community in Sri Lanka, because in a sense, it's a very complex situation. But the abrogation of these pacts laid the ground for Tamil militancy. And then also colonization projects within Sinhala Buddhist nationalisms. There was a yearning for the kind of spatial domination of the whole island. If only there weren't parts of the island where a minority was in the majority. So there were attempts through colonization to lower the Tamil majority in some areas. Trincomalee in the east of the island was a Tamil majority town at independence. Now it's roughly 50-50 Sinhala and Tamil, partly due to the movement of Sinhala people into Trincomalee. Ampara, as it's now called, is a Sinhala majority town in the east. It was a majority Muslim town, was Ampara, but because of colonization, its demography changed, and these kind of things fed into ethnic war. And again, I haven't got time to go into all of this, but I suppose one turning point in the growth of the ethnic war was the 1983 pogrom against Tamils. This internationalized the issue, and there were successive waves of ethnic war and then peace process. And what is evident from this kind of process is that there were nationalistic or Sinhala protectionist forces pulling the rug under peace processes that could have granted devolution. The devolution package of 1995 to 2000 eventually failed. The peace process from 2002 to 2006 eventually failed. And I'm not saying that the causes of this, or there was one cause of this, and that this was Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. That would be far too simplistic. By the time of the early noughties, the LTTE had become a monster. It had become a terrorist group, and was resistant to some of the attempts by the South to create peace. But Sinhala Buddhist nationalisms did contribute. And one of their mantras almost was that there's no ethnic problem, there's only a terrorist problem. Refusing to really look at the root causes of the ethnic problem. Yes, there was a terrorist problem by the end of the war. I am not an apologist by any means for the LTTE. They did become a monster. But that the ethnic problem had roots in the post-independence history of Sri Lanka, and before that also cannot be doubted. So going to contemporary challenges, I believe I have a few moments left. I'm just going to pause to make sure I do justice to these contemporary challenges. I don't have time to go into one of the groups that arose to prominence after the ending of the war in 2009, and that is the Buddha Bala Sena, the Buddhist Defense Army or the Buddhist Defense Force, which in a sense can be compared with Mavatar, and indeed there have been links between Mavatar and the Buddha Bala Sena, and the Buddha Bala Sena definitely had political sponsorship. But the contemporary challenges for Sri Lanka I see a tendency to see the defense of Buddhism and Buddhist hegemony as more important than seeking for causes of problems. The present Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has said that he will look at the causes of the ethnic conflict and will seek solutions now, and he's calling for representations. But those who have been working for equality and justice in the country are not very hopeful about that. Another challenge, as Matthew has certainly stressed in his presentation, the role of the monastic Sangha. Traditionally, they have been seen as guardians of Sinhala Buddhist history, Sinhala Buddhist identity. They have been able to influence politicians. They are still able to influence politicians. But their voice is not unitary. There are some voices that have stressed that Sri Lanka is a multi-ethnic country and that all the religions and peoples of Sri Lanka must be respected. Others who stress a more Sinhala protectionist view. And after the ending of the war in 2009, there was a lot of rhetoric about reconciliation from the government and the ministry set up for reconciliation, but those in the north and east, the minorities in the north and east, have seen little fruits of that. There is continuing militarization and a continuing Buddhistization of the north and the east. My monograph, Religion, Space and Conflict, stresses in the last chapter some of the things that happened immediately after the war in terms of Buddhistizing sites which were in essence multi-religious and that kind of thing. There is continuing Buddhistization. And perhaps more importantly, there's marginalization of alternative histories, such as the fact that there's a lot of Tamil Buddhism in Sri Lanka at one point. A very interesting book written by Siva Tyagaraja, a Tamil, on Kantarode, which is a Buddhist site in the north of Sri Lanka, which particularly after the war, but even before the ending of the war, was being presented by Sinhala protectionists, I would say, as purely a Sinhala Buddhist site. Tyagaraja argues that it was a multi-ethnic site, that there were Tamil Buddhists in the north before a revival in Shaivism. And these alternative histories are marginalized, as is the archaeological history that South Indians were present in Sri Lanka from a very, very early stage. Now, I think that's about all I wanted to say. I've skated through a lot of territory and probably made a lot of generalizations that could be unpicked in conversation, but I hope that's served to kind of landscape this issue a little bit. Thank you very much. I will.
Thank you so much to both speakers. Just while Professor Harris ends the sharing. So I just
have I stopped it on my own?
Not yet, no.
Gosh. Oh, wait a minute. I've
just on the Zoom.
Yes, but I seem to have seen myself on the screen, but I've lost the Zoom link. All the I knew something was going on. Wait a minute.
That's right. I think at the bottom there of the slide, there's a Zoom icon. I think if you click on that.
Oh,
yeah.
right. Yes.
Hopefully. No.
I can see you, Russell, and Matthew, and I'm clicking on the Zoom item on the icon at the bottom, but nothing is happening. So sorry.
That's all right. Emran.
It's end share. No, has that gone now?
There we are. Thank you.
Sorry.
Not a problem at all.
I'm really not an IT expert.
It wouldn't be a Zoom webinar if there weren't some IT glitches. Thank you both for those presentations. Wonderfully rich presentations in the time you had. I'm amazed by how much material and historical context you were both able to cover in just a very short slot. So I am opening the floor to everybody who has come along. Please post your questions in the chat, and I can pass those along to the speakers. What I will do is start out with a question of my own, however. So Elizabeth, you spoke just now of subordinating inclusivism, as you called it. You spoke of a hierarchy of religions based on a fear of fragmentation, of hierarchy as a kind of bastion against chaos. And in the context of Myanmar, Matthew, I mean, you didn't use exactly the same terms, but it's obvious that there too, Buddhists have perceived a threat, let's say, to the Sangha, to the Dharma, right, to the very existence of Buddhism in the recent past, but also into the future. Now, this kind of these are both very, let's say, Buddhist-dominated contexts, Sri Lanka, in terms of just pure percentages, and so I suppose that kind of policy of subordinating inclusivism, if we want to call it that, may have worked in a context where a substantial majority belongs to one overlapping religious and ethnic identity. But what might happen, in your opinion, if and when the plurality, the religious/ethnic plurality increases? And I'm asking that because, of course, I'm speaking from Singapore, which is a highly religiously plural context. I mean, as is the UK and as is Canada, obviously. And so we're very much concerned to, I suppose, see what you might have to say about addressing the challenges that Buddhist nationalism or Buddhist protectionism or Buddhist extremism, Buddhist fundamentalism, whichever terms you may want to use, what kind of risks, what kind of challenges these movements pose in the region to contexts such as Singapore, but others who are trying to cultivate interreligious harmony. Are there any lessons to be learned? Any thoughts on where things are headed? Yes, I'll hand over the floor to either of you, really.
You want to start, Matthew?
No, please go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay. Yes, I mean, there is a certain attraction to the idea of subordinating inclusivism. If everyone recognizes one group as dominant, and then everyone can be slotted in underneath. But what happens when you have got sizable minorities that are actually the majority in certain areas of the country, in a political system that gives precedence to the majority, and this raises considerable problems to reinforcing the identity of the majority, servicing the interests of the minority groups and accepting them almost as equals. I would say that a pluralistic society should be one in which there is an equal playing field between the different communities and groups, and that they should all have should feel that their interests are being looked into, are being affirmed by the political party. But and so where you have got sizable minorities and a polity that places emphasis on majoritarianism, how do you create a system that will give power and to minorities? And I think the root cause of the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka was basically the political system, and that the Tamil minority just could not have their voice heard, could not press through legislation which would serve their interests and their concerns, and federalism. That was the answer put forward by some of the those interested in human rights or committed to kind of human rights and an equal playing field during the ethnic war. But federalism was like a red rag in front of a bull for singular extremists or singular Buddhists that I've been speaking about. Federalism was the destruction, the fragmentation, the chaos, that they most feared. It was the dividing of a country that was seen almost as the body of the Buddha. And, you know, I was in touch with groups who were thinking, yes, you know, the answer to the ethnic conflict that would have prevented the unimaginable bloodshed at the end of the war, you know, was federalism. But federalism just was not acceptable to a sizable, not to all, but to a sizable portion of the Buddhist community. Because of the imaginaire I've tried to kind of evoke. So, and I don't know what the answer to that is. I really don't. I wish I did. The strength of the imaginaire, which says, you know, that Sri Lanka is singular Buddhist and cannot be divided, is so strong. And the sense of threat is incredibly deep in Sri Lanka. And again, I've tried to move into this mindset so I can see how strong it is. A sense of threat from Christian missionaries, from Tamils, and after the war from Muslims. Buddha Bala Sena, the Muslim threat. We have to protect. So there's no answers there. And certainly in terms of what challenges pose for the region, only more questions.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on this. I mean, I really appreciate Elizabeth's subordinating inclusivism kind of framework here, and you know, I know that's used to describe the mechanisms of a period in the past. But I think, you know, we see it persisting in certain ways and institutionalized in certain ways. One of the things that I find striking in contemporary Myanmar is that had worked with colleagues, Matt Schisler and Pu Pu Thi, on a project called Myanmar Media and Society Project. And one of those, one aspect of it was collecting people's narratives of what they understood as kind of peaceful interreligious coexistence. These were stories about, and this was generated because youth that we were working with were worried that they didn't have the same experience as their parents, having grown up in a different kind of context. And while these were often really inspiring narratives, there was frequently a sort of subtext to them that was like, we were fine because our Muslims were kind of quieter, right? They, you know, the Christians weren't advocating for this and that, you know, and it often was subtextual, right? It was unspoken, you know, but there, you know, which is not the kind of thing that people are aspiring to, not the kind of interreligious coexistence that people are aspiring to. I'll note just a few kind of quick parallels or resonances with everything that Elizabeth said about the political system and how you know, various forms of majoritarian politics or majoritarian benefiting politics were institutionalized over time. And Myanmar's 2008 constitution particularly tried to give some opportunities for kind of devolution of power, representation for certain minorities, and in the context of broader threat, that was perceived as, you know, the first step towards balkanization and et cetera, right? So what I find particularly interesting is that some of the strongest voices, especially of youth in the kind of revolutionary movement against the military, are explicitly rejecting, you know, a federal model for this. Now they're doing that in very careful ways, right? Because you know, they don't support the disenfranchisement of ethnic groups that have been fighting for more autonomy and things like that, but they sort of recognize that I've got somebody who wants to help with the presentation here as well. But they want to find some other foundation for inclusion for this, right? For national inclusion. And the threat, I think everybody's kind of clear that the threat from the military, the kind of shared threat from the military, brings people together temporarily, but not necessarily, doesn't provide the foundations for that. And so, so people are kind of articulating that in important new ways. But you know, they see the video, that famous video of the kids running in on that professor who was doing that, and then they want to emulate that as well.
Of course, of course.
No. Okay. And yeah, so I think that that's again, they don't have the answers for that, but I think a lot of the youth are really articulating a new the need for new terms of belonging, and that's exciting if still unspecified.
Those are both very rich answers. So bouncing off from that, and this kind of impetus towards new modes of belonging, as you put it, Matthew, just a moment ago. I want to ask, kind of bouncing off from that, regarding the political systems. Elizabeth, you also mentioned that the political system was kind of at fault in the Sri Lankan case for not granting autonomy and agency to minorities. There seems to be a recurring theme. So what is and what has been, and what in a way should be, if I can ask that, the role of the state in dealing with lay Buddhists, monastic Buddhists, who, well, are acting overtly violently against perceived threats, be they overtly religious threats against, say, such as Islam, or ethnically identified threats such as the Rohingya, and that kind of ties into in a way the flip side of the question, which is that posed in the chat, which is to do with the idea of a Buddhist state, right? Is how mainstream is this idea of a Buddhist state? Are there any elements in the teachings that these various political Buddhist figures have voiced in support of granting religious, as it were, legitimacy to the idea of an overtly Buddhist state?
Well, should I go again, since yes, Matthew, the last to speak? In the role of the state, I think the role of the state is to enforce the rule of law, and there is an independent judiciary as well in Sri Lanka, although that independence has been threatened. Buddhism is not a state religion in Sri Lanka. According to the constitution, it has foremost place. That was according to the 1972 constitution. But then there are clauses which say that minorities should be protected. And I think the state should be upholding the rule of law in that respect, so that if there is hate speech against Muslims coming from a group such as Buddha Bala Sena, they don't feel as vocal as they were. They haven't got such they haven't got patronage so much. Yes, if they are using hate speech which goes against the constitution, against the rule of law, the role of the state is to come down on them and not to play to extremist voices, I would say. As a definite role for the state, but also for dialogue, to actually enable a dialogue between different communities and voices, so that in a sense, those with more extremist views are almost forced to listen to the views of others. I mean, during the war, it was when some NGOs were working in Sinhala villages and working with Buddhists and saying, this is what the Tamil people are suffering in the north. It's similar to what you have perhaps suffered. Then, opinions changed. Encouraging empathy, intercommunal kind of empathy, interreligious empathy, I think is incredibly important. I think the state has a role as that, as well as non-state actors.
Matthew?
Yeah, so the question in the chat, and then your question, Rafael, is really interesting. And I think, within the Theravada tradition, just speaking there, we've got canonical texts that seem to speak to, the role of the state, right, and of political actors, whether that's kings or others, as being necessary for the support of, a good Buddhist community, of sasana, of promoting practice. You've got Chakravarti Sihanada Sutta, you've got the Aganya Sutta that people have interpreted as, having political things. These are contested. I'm just talking about, resources that people use. And there's also the kind of strong model that others put forward, the Ashokan model, right, of the sort of paradigmatic Theravada king, that scholars have studied, that also, activists and others have put forward. Now, we also know that each of those, has been used to kind of defend an explicitly Buddhist state and the need for a kind of Buddhist state and polity, but also to kind of defend instead the idea of a sort of moral polity, right? And these are the more kind of like pluralist interpretations of the Ashokan inscriptions that say Dhamma is not intended to be a sort of specifically Buddhist thing, but can be, more capacious for those things. So the resources are there that people have used to argue for an explicitly Buddhist state, the need for a Buddhist state. And then also to argue, that these same scriptural and canonical resources can provide a sense of religious or cultural pluralism. Myanmar, we've got the particular situation where, the state has been pretty consistently seen over, much of the last century as potentially the enemy, right? And so, and we see that now again, with the military coup. And so, one of the things that I tried to note in my remarks there was about the eye of the beholder, right? What is misbehavior and who is misbehaving, right? So, from the point of view of the regime and the monastic protests in 2007, what a lot of people called the Saffron Revolution, that was monks behaving badly, right? Whereas from the supporters of that was the regime behaving badly and monks being the sort of moral voice. And you get the same thing, right? Is a monk preaching against Muslims in defense of Buddhism a monk behaving badly, right? These are what's being contested kind of here, right? And we actually did have a good amount of public discursive contestation there as well. Especially you saw more of that under the NLD government when those voices were allowed. And that's not, I don't want to try to valorize the NLD government in that in every respect, but in that respect, they did, try to kind of even that that sort of playing field there. But I think what we see in Myanmar is, a much deeper skepticism of, what the state can do, should do, and has, with the repressive roles it's been playing as well.
Thank you. So both of you spoke quite a bit in your responses about discourse and discourses against violence, against marginalizing communities, various modes of discursive contestation. So maybe kind of switching to that focus, I wanted to ask about some of the specific strategies that Burmese and Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists, or if we want to use that term, what discursive strategies have they used in spreading their rhetoric? And I suppose related to that, how can such discourses be countered effectively? And I ask this because there's a question which I've received to myself, which I'm not sure everybody else can see, but which is to what extent has there been a spread of Buddhist protectionism kind of and its conceptual categories, its modes of discourse, its ideas to other parts of the world and into mainstream Buddhism, whatever that might be, in different contexts. So yes, specific strategies, ways to counteract them, and how have these ideas, these conceptual categories, seeped out into other contexts. Maybe Elizabeth, you can start first.
That's a massive kind of area. I mean, discursive strategies. I'd say there are many other Buddhist voices in Sri Lanka than the Buddhist protectionism. And there has been right throughout the war. I know I interviewed in the mid-1990s some Buddhist monks who were working in majority Tamil areas who had put their lives at risk in order to protect Tamil people. But some of these stories are the ones that have got out to the West and to Western Buddhists and so on, as examples of a discourse that opposes the hegemonic discourse that says that in a sense Sri Lanka is a singular Buddhist country. I would say that the stories of bravery and the counter narratives that come out from Sri Lanka have been, quite effective more globally. But Sinhala Buddhists feel that the West, for instance, some Christian organizations like the World Council of Churches are branding them as, or have branded them as, extremist and terrorist, and because of their kind of protectionism. And again, the victimhood kind of idea comes in. So it's incredibly complex here. But I certainly know that the more the extremist voices, the protectionist voices are certainly in Sri Lanka, have certainly been influential in Myanmar and vice versa. They have been influential in Thailand, across the Pali Buddhist world, some people call it the Theravada Buddhist world. There is certainly communication, and there has certainly been violence against minorities, not only in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, but also in Thailand and other contexts. And so in a sense, that extremist rhetoric, protection of Buddhism is necessary, has come out. But also, particularly Western Buddhists and others might say, well, what are the counter voices? And there are a lot of counter voices. And Matthew mentioned the young people, the youth. And I think in recent months, the protests in Sri Lanka have shown that the youth want to go beyond these labels, ethnic labels, saying, we are Sri Lankan. That's the most important thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you. It's an impossible question, so over to you, Matthew, if you want to have a try.
So it's a really good question, and I'm going to try to answer the other question in the chat from Alami here, possibly as I come in to this. So one of the things that we found, interestingly, in Myanmar is that there are often kind of limited sort of formal doctrinal, again, or canonical references in in the writings and the sermons of Mavatha groups or monks, right? These treatises often use demographic data and things like that, sometimes cherry picked, sometimes just flat out false. There's more of a reliance on some particular Jataka tales, and especially the ones that give you a kind of pithy, sort of takeaway. One that was really popular was the kind of that talks about hosts and guests, right? I mean, this notion of like, we're here, this is our home, we're hosting you, right? And that's had particular resonance as well, But again, there's not a lot of doctrinal arguments, for this. One of the things that we've noticed, again, this is me pulling from some of the work that the Myanmar Media and Society Project did, is that there's a kind of discursive linking of several different levels that we might call it. So, one is frequently sort of drawing on what I called the kind of post 9/11 global war on terror discourse, right? I mean, this is something that actors in these countries have used to sort of justify their work. They've been influenced by it over the last 20 years. I mean, some of the actors have been explicitly influenced by it, and a way of kind of saying, look, we're engaged in the same thing as you all are, to the actors in Western countries doing that. So you've got those kind of more global and regional narratives. Then you've got what I call the kind of hyper-local specific examples in particular places. And this goes down even to kind of personalized examples. So what we would often see was the sort of like, well, my cousin lives in this place where he works with this guy who used to work with a Muslim guy who did this, right? And so, you get those, and for everybody, it seemed like it could be tracked to these more, anecdotal examples, but they resonated, right? And so what people could do, what these rhetorical kind of mediators could do is take the global narratives, take the hyper-local anecdotal, and then spread those pretty effectively to a national narrative. So it's really hard in most of Karen state on the east and the border with Thailand to build a plausible theory of Islamic takeover of that area. But a handful of sort of Muslim majority villages, right? Then combine with, these other rhetorics to kind of like, build up the threat. And this is the final thing that I would say. I think it's the threat that is the threat narrative is the only one that I see as plausibly connecting these places, because what you do see is you see a shared articulation of threat, and that does empower and enable people. But in every one of these situations, Ben Shonthal and I wrote this piece a while back looking at specifically at Sri Lanka and Myanmar, and we kind of think the same thing is going on here. In each of these places, these movements are responding to localized dynamics, right? And to the political context specifically about what happens. Halal was not a thing in the discussion in Myanmar because Myanmar doesn't have a kind of like government-led halal regime where people are seen to be benefiting from it, right? And so I think what ended up is that each of these moments of potential transnational and regional, kind of sharing and collaboration was really undermined by, enabled by a shared sense of threat, but then undermined by the particular dynamics in places. And what we saw was, about a decade or less even, where everything converged for Islam and Muslims to be taken up as the threat, right? Even though, people's anxieties were actually articulated towards economic and political, kind of uncertainties. But now we've seen a kind of reflattening of that in a lot of these places, right? To a broader range of anxieties.
Right. Thank you. Well, we are out of time, but I just want to ask one, if I may, one kind of follow-up question about those threats. So obviously, a lot of the threats are perceived to be internal to these contexts, but threats have historically also come from abroad. Obviously, Elizabeth, you spoke at length about Western colonialism, about coexistence betrayed, mutual interreligious demonization, etc. And so I would assume that on the one hand, yes, there is a kind of co-opting of post 9/11 Western demonization of the Muslim other, but on the other hand, quite a reticence to allow any intervention on the part of Western powers in these contexts, given the colonial history. So my question is, given that, well, what opportunities does that present to, let's say, growing Asian powers in the region to intervene, to exert greater geopolitical power in their backyard, and thereby to kind of use this as an opportunity to increase their global standing? Just very briefly.
Well, Sri Lanka is already linked with China in myriad ways because of Chinese loans. China has got a lot of influence in Sri Lanka and could use this for good or for bad. I positively think that other Asian countries have got a lot of potential to influence. But sometimes this has like a negatively. I mean, the West were pressing Sri Lanka not to go for the final violence at the end of the war, but Sri Lanka knew that it had the support of Russia and China, and knew that it just didn't need the support of the West to do what they did. So, yeah, Sri Lanka is very, I think, sensitive to international pressures, and I think there is opportunity there for dialogue, for mutual influence, yes, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Rafael, you phrased the question as Asian powers, right? And I think we kind of need to disaggregate that, because obviously, China has, China's been China has intended to stabilize things for its own benefit, right? But has often been, acted as a destabilizing force as well. There are a lot of folks in Myanmar who would welcome a more assertive ASEAN, to put pressure on the regime, where ASEAN has been pretty reticent. I think, if we're asking Asian powers, not national powers necessarily, I am not convinced that Asian Buddhist networks have these significant cross-national powers of influence, right? I mean, we kind of talk about Theravada, but scholars do, but very few people imagine themselves as, kind of Theravada Buddhists. I tell this story a lot. I remember a time when Sulak Sivaraksa came and gave talks to, to Buddhists in Myanmar, and people were there and very polite, and they said, well, that's great. And so much convergence among, sort of religious pluralism advocates. And they said, well, that's just lovely, but that's not really our kind of Buddhism, right? I mean, that's that's not, and so, there are, whether they're national or subnational, I just think it's not expressed in that way. And, but you also do get, it's an opportunity to think about how people come together in ways that are not predetermined by, kind of categories of politics or religious pluralism that come from the West, right? So I'm going to mention human rights, and this is not to say that human rights, that, not some sort of Asian values kind of version of this argument, but to say one of the things that my colleagues and I noticed a lot in Myanmar was that, the urban Yangon-based women's groups who argued in terms of human rights, were making arguments that you thought would resonate with, women's groups that were facing persecution elsewhere. And it was partly this kind of rhetoric around rights that just didn't fly, right? It didn't resonate with people, whether that's because conceptually it doesn't work, whether that's because when you see the state as a threat, you're less inclined to do that. But that creates the opportunity, right? And I think that's an important lesson for folks in Singapore, where a rights-based discourse is kind of well established, even as Singapore was also the kind of locus point of Asian values arguments for decades. But to say, these are opportunities to support these discourses emerging in ways that are not predetermined by, a set of tools that might be common in the West or in other Southeast Asian countries, but look for the resonance in these specific places.
Right. Thank you both for those responses. I know that there are a couple of other questions, but unfortunately we don't have time for all of them. I want to thank you both for your presentations and for such rich answers to what I think are quite difficult questions on very complex topics, especially given that we're trying to negotiate 3 different time zones. So Matthew, once again, thank you for meeting us at the crack of dawn in Canada. Elizabeth Harris, thank you for meeting us around midday in the UK, and thank you for everyone who has joined us from the entire globe on this platform. And I will sign off in that case. Just thank you once more for your presentations, and all the very best in that case. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Bye bye.